Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am honored to have Jessica Tracy. Jessica is a professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia and a Sauder Distinguished Scholar. Currently, her research is supported by Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada Insight Grant. She is the associate editor at the journal Affective Science. Her main research interests include emotions, moral thinking, nonverbal expression, the self-conscious emotions such as shame and pride, narcissism, status and hierarchy, and many current trends in psychological science. She is the author of the popular book Pride, The Secret of Success, which you can find everywhere. I was super lucky that she was fortunate enough to come on the podcast. I was really excited, really happy, and we had a great conversation. I looked at much of her research when I was in grad school as a grad student, and so it was real big honor for me. And I really enjoyed the conversation we had, talking about stuff that's up my alley clinically and stuff that she's been doing for better half of 15-20 years. In the conversation, we start out by talking what are emotions and their evolutionary function. Emotions are one of those strange things in that we all have them, we all feel them, we all experience them, but it's really hard for people to really understand kind of what they are, like kind of defining them, and then explain their function and their utility. And many people try to go throughout life trying to minimize or suppress their emotions. And one of the wonderful things about Jessica is that she's doing good work to help us understand them more, so we can understand more about the human experience. We talk about the basic emotions, and then we talk about the self-conscious and also the social emotions. The four major ones are pride, shame, guilt, and embarrassment, and we talk about those generally. We talk about the distinctions and differences between what affect is, what feelings are, and what emotions are. I think this is a really helpful part of the conversation, because a lot of the times, myself included for a long time, we kind of get these confabulated. And so hopefully she does a really nice job of explaining the differences, and hopefully that can be very helpful for listeners. We talk about this distinction of positive and negative emotions, and one of my hobby horses is that I get real frustrated by those terms. Jessica, I think, agrees. We use them, it's fine, but it really is not as accurate as it probably should. Emotions are more neutral than kind of a positive, negative, good, bad kind of false dichotomy. Talk about social emotions and other mammals and animals and what that looks like. We then launch into a discussion, which is really her work, is the emotion of pride. She gives a definition of pride, its functionality for status and rank, talks about the two different types of pride, and maybe looking at pride as a type of system. We talk about what we mean by the self, and where pride fits in there. We talk about pride in non-weird populations, and how we recognize pride expression around the world. We talk about, if pride and shame are expressed privately along with publicly. We talk about the evolutionary psychology models and that kind of camp with the social psychology model and that camp, and kind of looking at the differences of how they understand pride or other emotions, and how we try to obtain dominance and hierarchy. We talk about the positive and negative aspects of both authentic and hubristic pride. Talk about shame and pride as they interact at an implicit level. Some of the measures used for assessing pride and shame. And then her recent paper on talking about distinct positive emotions. And we kind of end with talking about the need for developing a newer taxonomy or a newer system of how we understand what emotions are. If we're talking about subjective experiences, how do we accurately give labels for those experiences that we're having? Some of them may be universal, some of them may be more distinct, and how do we keep trying to do good science to figure that out? Again, I was so blessed, so fortunate to talk with her. She's a super lovely person, super brilliant. I really love this conversation, and I hope all the listeners out there enjoy it as much as I did. So now I bring you Jessica Tracy. I'm here with Jessica Tracy. Jessica, thank you so very much for coming on. It's a big honor, big privilege. I'm very excited to talk to you.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Okay, I'll give you an intro in the beginning so we don't have to go too in depth, but just tell people who you are and what you do and what you study and what your big area of interest is.
Sure. So I'm a professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver, BC. And I am in the social personality area of psychology, which basically at a very broad level means I study why people do the things they do socially, I suppose, and why they are the way they are and how people are different from one another, which, you would think maybe that's what all of psychology does, but and to some extent it is. But my particular area that I specialize in is emotions, broadly speaking. And I have done sort of the majority of my research on emotions that are known as self-conscious emotions, which is to say emotions that are all about how we feel about ourselves. So pride and shame and guilt and that sort of thing. And in particular, I've done a lot of work on pride. But I'm also really interested in social rank and social hierarchy, moral emotions and moral judgments and moral thinking, and as well as how personality and emotion intersect. And I've done a bunch of work on that. So that's kind of that's
wonderful. Yeah, you run your own lab, is that correct?
Yeah. So UBC is a major research university, and so all of the faculty members there kind of have their own labs, and a bunch of grad students and undergrads working in the lab, and it's really great. It's a fabulous opportunity and environment for getting work and doing exciting stuff. So,
No, that's wonderful. We'll get to one of the more recent papers you've done, which I thought was brilliant. I've read it a few times and it's quite long and really good. And so we'll get to that. So yeah, it's really nice to see that you're putting out really good research on important stuff.
Thanks so much.
On the podcast, I haven't really had too many people on that do research on emotions kind of proper. It's been talked about, or I've talked about it. So I think it may be really helpful first to just kind of give an overview of kind of emotions, and then we can dive into the self-conscious emotions, or sometimes I think they're also known as the social emotions, although that's an interesting term for them. So maybe just tell us as best you can. Sometimes it's a hard thing to start with, but what are emotions and what are some of the kind of evolutionary functions of them and the pro-social elements, and then we can talk about some of the differences. So maybe just start out there and kind of the basic emotions, all that good stuff.
Sure. Yeah. No, and I'm glad you said evolutionary functions, because that is how I see emotions as functional from an evolutionary perspective. We evolved to experience them. They're part of human nature as well as animal nature. Other animals, I guess all other animals experience emotions at some level. So my view on emotions, which is sort of the general, I think the functionalist or evolutionary approach to emotions, is that emotions, they're super complicated and they're not really one thing. I would describe them more as a process. So when you experience an emotion, what that means is you are responding to an environmentally significant event, which is to say something that's important for your survival, your social relationships, things that matter to you and has been historically to our species over time. And the idea is that you have emotions to help you respond to those events as adaptively as possible, right? So in other words, we evolved so that if something, frightening occurs, or, we see a bear, something like that, we respond to that situation, which could kill us in a way that's going to make our survival and our, ability to continue reproducing, our genes' ability to continue reproducing as likely as possible. And so emotions kind of include a whole bunch of features that help us do that. So of course there's the feeling. And I think, when we talk about emotions, that's sort of what most people think of first is, oh, well, I feel scared. That's what fear is. Absolutely. That's a big part of it, but that's not all of it. So there are behaviors. So when you feel fear, you also want to run. You're motivated to kind of move. Maybe you get jittery. Maybe you freeze, right? There's sort of a flight or fright kind of thing. Freezing or fleeing, I guess. So there's that. There's also a nonverbal expression. With fear, there's a facial display we show. In my lab, we're also finding that there's bodily displays that go with these emotions. And people recognize these displays. And so that's really adaptive also, because it sort of sends a message to others that there's danger in the environment. And so there's a broader adaptive kind of level there. There's cognitive changes, right? All of a sudden with fear, we're oriented towards sounds and sights that might be particularly dangerous, right? Our visual orientation and kind of what we see and pay attention to, that changes. And then there's physiological changes, right? Our heart rate speeds up with fear. Some emotions cause hormonal changes. Some emotions make us feel sick, right? I mean, there's all different kinds of things that happen in the body because emotions are very much existing in the body. They're not just the mind, they're sort of the whole body. Of course, the mind is part of the body. So kind of broad strokes, that's what I would say an emotion is. And I've been using the example of fear because I think it's sort of the easiest one to make the case that, okay, look, this is clearly functional from an evolutionary perspective. Researchers have historically talked about a small set of emotions, which they call the basic emotions. Those are ones that, back in the 70s, Paul Ekman, who's sort of a founder of the field, found that they have distinct facial expressions that people all over the world reliably recognize. And that's fear, anger, sadness, disgust, happiness. Let's say fear, anger, sadness, disgust, happiness. Well, it's those 5 plus contempt. Ekman includes contempt. Contempt is more contentious. The data is not totally there, but in any case, those are the ones that sort of, okay, people all over the world recognize these facial expressions. That said, since that time, a number of studies have been put out there showing that other emotions might also kind of constitute these basic emotions to the extent that they are evolved, that they have distinct nonverbal displays. So pride is one I've spent a lot of time studying. Pride does have a nonverbal expression that's reliably recognized by people all over the world. It's also functional. But of course, I think it's fair to say that emotions that don't fit that little category are different in one way or another. They are, as you kind of alluded to, they're more social. Some of them are about the self. They're kind of a different level of experience than what I would call the basic emotions.
Yeah, that's great. I think most people's very introduction of sorts, if they haven't taken an intro to psych class, will be to the film Inside Out, which actually does a decent job of showing the nuance with I think they use 4 or 5 of the 6 or whatever historical basic emotions. And
they do a great job.
The spoiler alert for this is that most people will see that it's like, oh, being sad has a function to it, right? Yeah. This isn't just this thing we got to get rid of. Like, we need that. The movie does a great job of showing that, and at such a really interesting age of the main character. I think she's 11. So some people will have some of that, and that's actually not that far off. I mean, Pixar usually does pretty good research. So
no, and in fact, a collaborator of mine, Dr. Keltner, who was a student of Paul Ekman, he's the person who consulted.
Oh, cool. Super
movie.
Cool.
So they really based it off the actual research they should be basing it off of. And I think they did an awesome job. So,
yeah, especially in that movie and how they connected it with how it stores into long-term memory, how, there's some really cool stuff on how they show that visually. So it's really, really nice to see that. But yeah, so those are kind of the basic emotions. When I've taught and when sometimes if I tell clients, I also use fear as an example because it's like the easiest one, I think, for people to get. I usually at least say it's kind of like a smoke detector of sorts in a house, right? Yeah. It's telling you there's something that's going off, and it doesn't tell you necessarily how to behave, right? It's telling you that there is something going on and you should check that out, because if you don't, you could get harmed. You could potentially get harmed. There are obviously much more complicated things to emotions, right? That's a very basic level, kind of again on a survival level that we need, but they function in a way that tries to help us survive. And in that moment, you're not going to be thinking about, what am I going to have for dinner or what am I going to have for lunch? You're going to be like, I need to, get the hell out of here, or I'm going to, die in flames potentially, right? It's a signal. And so when you have some type of fear, it kind of not overloads the brain, but it's basically the main signal that's saying, like, this needs to be investigated. We need to do something. And as you obviously point out, that's going to have some aspect of behavior, physiological responses, how we're thinking or not thinking about things, et cetera. Yeah. So that's great. So there's this other category of what we call self-conscious or social emotions. Yeah, it's kind of used interchangeably.
To some extent,
yeah. So the 4 major ones are pride, shame, guilt, embarrassment, some people put one or two other ones in there more recently. Am I wrong on this?
Yeah, well, so my take is that it really depends on whether you're using the label social or self-conscious, because right, self-conscious is a bit more narrow. That is to say, it refers specifically to emotions. My definition is emotions that in order to experience, we need to activate our self-awareness and focus on our self-representations, which is basically is just a way of saying we need to think about ourselves. We need to make a self-evaluation. And so you don't experience pride, shame, guilt, or embarrassment without making a self-evaluation, without thinking, how do I feel about myself right now? Do I feel good? Do I feel bad? And why? But there are other emotions that are critically social, and the self-conscious emotions are also critically social. We have them for very social reasons, but that aren't necessarily requiring a self-evaluation. So I think jealousy is a classic example. There's a lot of evidence that jealousy has evolved. It certainly seems to be functional, in terms of mate retention, which is really important in our evolutionary history. But it's not really, it doesn't really require self-evaluation. If anything, if you start self-evaluating when you're feeling jealous, you might think, wait a minute, maybe this isn't a good look for me. Right. It's much more focused on other people, right? That is to say your partner and the problematic party. So I wouldn't define that as a self-conscious emotion, but I would certainly say it's a social emotion. And there's other ones that fit in that category too, that you're right. A lot of research has come out in recent years suggesting this. So gratitude is one that's received a lot of attention. There's work on admiration.
I think regret is one of them. No, am I wrong?
Regret. I am so mixed on regret. I find regret to be a cognitive state that I'm not sure. I think it's a way to be sad is what I would say. It's sort of like maybe a mixture of sadness and fear, but kind of backwards looking, whereas fear is typically forwards looking. I don't study regret. This is just sort of my take, but I don't know of any of it. For me, it's like, there's so many different feelings that we feel, right? And so much of them parse into broader states. So, this is a classic thing is, if my partner is angry or if she seems angry, I'll often say, hey, are you angry? And her response is, I'm not angry, I'm just frustrated. And, right. This is sort of a classic thing. And my feeling is like, fair enough. But frustration to me, that's a mild form of anger, right? Yeah. That means you're not quite at the level where you'd be like, I'm screaming and raging, but you're like annoyed. Right. And so, from an emotional research perspective, which I'm sure is exactly what she wants to hear, these aren't totally different things, right? And so that's kind of, I think, an important thing to keep in mind that, if you're really thinking from an evolutionary standpoint, you want to think about what did we evolve to experience? What is cross-cultural? What is part of human nature? And my guess is that anger is, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, fear is, a number of these other things are, jealousy probably is. Is frustration? Well, maybe every culture has come up with sort of a mild version of anger. That would make sense. But it's still going to be part of anger. And we just, it's probably not distinctive is I guess the thing. And so I would say the same thing about regret. My guess is every culture everywhere is going to have sadness. Are they all going to have come up with sort of a cognitive variant that involves whatever the distinction that we think of when we think of regret, and to me, to find that out, the evidence I want to look for is there a nonverbal display that's different from other emotions? Display? Is there a function that's different from other? To me, that's really critical. If it serves a different function, that's important, right? That's what the emotion is for. Is there a different physiological experience? So all that stuff is what I would look for to know, is this sort of an evolved basic thing, which isn't to say that we might not have lots of different experiences that are totally valid and important and worth studying. And I've done work on this actually that you mentioned to me over email where we're looking at subjective experience of emotion and how many different ones people experience. That's a really important question. It's just not the same question as how many emotions do we evolve to experience.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. But before I move on to the next point, there's we've already been going around it, but how do you I remember when I first learned all this, and then even still, it can sometimes be very difficult to explain to people the difference between feelings, affect, and emotions, right? And like you were saying, we feel a lot of things, right? But that's a piece or major piece of an emotion. There are other things, as you were saying, behaviors or physiological responses that are responsible for emotions. But in your mind, how do you usually explain the kind of nuanced differences between affect, emotions, and feelings?
Yeah, so I would say affect, as it's typically defined by emotional researchers, is kind of just this almost core sort of neurological sense of, is good or bad happening, right? I mean, at a very basic level, and that's sort of a valence-based distinction. Other people might make another distinction, but I think that is, it's really just sort of almost this basic part of emotion, absolutely, but not the whole thing, right? That if you're talking about affect, you're just talking about one piece of it. Maybe the thing that is crucial to what makes it an emotion, as opposed to a cognition or a belief or a story, whatever else there can be. The affect is crucial to it. It's just not the whole thing. It's sort of this core, almost, neurological part of it. Feelings are probably similar, but they're a lot more complex because feelings have cognition added to them. Right. So feeling is the affect plus all the cognitive stuff that we attach to it, much of which we probably evolved to attach to it, much of which our cultures have taught us to attach to it, because cultures have different sort of, cognitive understandings and perceptions of emotions and so on. And then I would say an emotion, that's the whole thing, right? That is the feeling, the affect, the behavior, the cognition, the facial expression, the whole thing put together is an emotion.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Now, this is again, maybe just a kind of a picky thing, but I was kind of trained that we don't really like, and again, it's used in scientific papers all the time, and I don't know if it's just maybe just one of those like picky things that people like to fight about, but it was this whole thing of like, there are positive and negative emotions. And most of the time, I think if the layperson were to read that, they would say, well, those are the good emotions and those are the bad emotions, right? So I don't want jealousy and anger and, pride, or maybe other regret, if you want to call it that, those are the negative ones, and the positive ones, such as, elation or awe or happiness or contentment.
Yeah.
Those are the positive ones, and those are the ones I want. I feel like sometimes when people read positive, negative, they see good, bad, and that's not exactly it's not apples to apples in that way, but it is an interesting kind of way of seeing that. And do you feel that I guess categorization of positive, negative emotions, is that helpful? Is it maybe misleading, or are we putting some kind of valence or kind of thing of like good, bad kinds of implicit aspects of it in there? Or do you like the positive and negative, kind of dichotomy, or what are your kind of just general thoughts on how that's used?
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I don't like it. I find it really problematic, actually. And, it's funny because there's been a whole movement in psychology overall to focus on the positive psychology movement in the past couple of decades. Same thing in the emotion field. There's now, a positive emotion pre-conference to, an emotion conference. I think that's not a bad thing. I think it's a really good thing, because there has been a disproportionate focus historically on what we would call the negative, right? And so I think we want to study everything. We have to study the emotions that we call positive. Absolutely. Right. Whether or not we should be calling them positive and distinguishing them from other emotions in that way, I think I agree with you. It's really unclear what the basis for that distinction is often. So typically what we mean is like, oh, it feels good or it feels bad. But that's messy, right? Because anger is always classified as a negative emotion. But when you feel anger, it doesn't necessarily feel bad, right? Sometimes self-righteous anger can feel really good, right? That's what gets us going. And, I've been, you get angry at a politician, you find yourself yelling, and sometimes it's frustrating, but other times it's like energizing, right? And so I think it's just really, and like you said, even if we are just talking about the feeling experience, that might not be the right basis for making these distinctions. You put pride among the negatives. Pride actually feels pretty good, right? And we've actually found there's two different kinds of pride, one of which has good outcomes as well. But you're right, there's certainly arrogance, which is, quite problematic, but might still feel good. And so I think it's sort of, there's this complication of like, well, how do you even define positive, negative? And then if you're talking about, is it functional? They're all functional. Like you put it, no one I know likes to feel sad. I mean, I guess, people go to those movies where someone dies and it's horrible, but right. Setting that aside, sadness is a really unpleasant experience, but you're right. It's so important, right? I mean, it really shapes our behavior in ways that we need. And it's funny, I taught an emotion class last year for grad students, and we had a whole conversation about a woman who can't feel sadness because of a neurological thing that they're actually still trying to understand. It's really fascinating. It was covered in the New Yorker. It was really interesting. She's super happy. She's married, she's just got this great life. Her first husband committed suicide, and she went to work the next day.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And she talks about it, and she's like, that was his thing. I'm good. And so we hear that, and we're like, that's so callous. And so I, posed the question to my students, who wants to be her if you could? And you're shaking your head. No one did. You're right. And I think everyone thought life would lose a lot of meaning. And, if
absolutely. Well, and to me, when I teach, I usually tell my students, I'm like, emotions they're not the things that make us human, but it's like half of what makes us human, if you will. It's like, that is part of the human experience. And the fact that we have so many emotions and so many different types and how we express them. Like, those are the things that we shouldn't, I mean, of course, there's an appropriate level of inhibition in certain contexts, of course, but in the general aspect, you want to be able to have a full menu of emotions, because those are ways of, in a sense, having a subjective experience of, or how to express that subjective experience, and not having sadness. I mean, as much as it sucks, it doesn't sometimes feel good to feel sad. It is telling you something is going on, that you're living, that you're alive, that something is impacting you. It's
absolutely.
And I mean, that would be terrifying to not have that. So,
right.
yeah.
Well, I mean, you probably deal with people who are grieving. You want to grieve, right? I mean, it's problematic when something horrible happens to not grieve. And so
people feel clogged. They feel stuck. I can't express this sadness, and obviously people express it differently, but you want to access that. And when they can't, it does feel kind of like they are really stuck. So I always, I'm not the person that's always trying to, be corrective and be like, well, positive, negative emotions. I mean, I understand what people mean when they say that, but I think personally, and we agree, I think we should maybe find different ways of, or different buckets, if you will, of how we understand, all emotions are valuable or can be valuable. All of them have a necessity, and how we're able to understand the nuance with all of them, because many people, which we'll get into, is, if you ask someone what they think about pride, that, they're going to, frown and be like, ooh, yikes, that's, kind of these narcissistic assholes, but that's, such a caricature of what the, kind of the complexity of what pride is and how important it is. And I think if people were to understand all of the, those complexities of one emotion like pride, or an emotion like shame, you can understand, whoa, that's super, super complex and super valuable and super important, for my ways of experiencing the world. And so, I have, I have a lot of frustration of people that try to paint shame, because I did research on shame, that try and paint shame in only a negative light. I get super frustrated with that, because it's like, it's not a fun feeling most of the time, but it does have many pro-social and curative aspects to it. It's a very complicated emotion, but it is super powerful, and it's super important for our sense of self. So we can talk about a little bit of that. So last thing on this is, with the self-conscious emotions and or social emotions, obviously, I think if I get this right, many other primates and other mammals feel emotions. Anger, joy, but do they feel, there are maybe some animals that have a small level of it, maybe not as much as humans, but what can we know, or what can we say, such as with, our, bonobos and, chimpanzee cousins, like, how do they experience self-conscious or social emotions as much as we know?
Yeah. It's a tough question, since it's hard to measure emotions like that. The evidence out there. So based on my understanding of it, my understanding is that, if we're talking about other great apes, there's some sense of self that is different from most other animals and similar to what humans have. And this is typically measured with something like the mirror self-recognition test. So, they do it with babies. And if you show a baby a mirror, the baby thinks it's another baby. And then all of a sudden they turn 18 months old about that. And you can try that if you have any, and if your listeners have any children this age, I did this. It's really cool to see, because around that age, you put something on their nose, like they would put a little bit of rouge on the baby's nose in this research, the baby immediately touches their nose. And that's a very exciting thing. And it's a sign of self-recognition, which is one of the earliest signs of understanding that, oh, I have a self, it's different from yourself, and so on. And they've done this with chimpanzees, and adult chimps, not baby chimps, but adult chimps pass the mirror test, right? So same thing. And that's really amazing to see also. I think, all the great apes do as it happens. I think they've done it with bonobos and orangutans and gorillas, and I'm pretty sure they all do. And then there's other random animals that do, so like dolphins do, and I shouldn't say random, dolphins are super smart. Magpies, I don't know anything about magpies and why, but that's the case. Other monkeys, no self-recognition. Dogs, cats, the animals that most of us are most familiar with, they do not have self-recognition. As anyone who has these pets knows, when they look at the mirror, they think it's another animal, or, they don't really care. They don't think it's themselves. So From that we can say, okay, well, in order to experience something like pride or shame, you have to think, I know who I am, and I'm a good person, or I'm a bad person. I did a good thing, I did a bad thing. You have to be able to distinguish yourself from others and have a sense of self. And if you don't have a sense of self, you can't experience those emotions. And so, as much as we all think, oh, my dog did this terrible thing. He ate, whatever he ate. My dog, I don't have a dog, but my partner's dog recently ate my glasses, and I was really angry. He didn't care at all,
Right.
We tried
no sense of shame. No shame.
Now people might think, oh, but he cowered, like I yell at him and he cowers. Well, sure. Dogs submit. They understand submission and dominance. And if the alpha is going to be scaring them, they will submit. That doesn't mean that they're feeling, I'm a bad dog. I did a really bad thing. I need to be a better dog. It's unlikely that's happening. So,
Yeah. And I think there's some other sea creatures also that pass the mirror test. I know that list keeps growing.
Yeah, totally. It's super cool.
Yeah. It's just super fascinating to see like, whoa, like, how many, there's a whole other conversation about, animal rights and things like that. But, there's this interesting thing about like many animals, especially like, orcas or dolphins, they know what's going on. Yeah. They're very social and they know what's going on and they know about themselves. And there's some interesting ideas there. And so it's interesting. Okay. So let's talk about pride. You know a few things about pride. You've written a few things.
You like to think so?
So I'll put the links in the notes, but you've written a book. I think you've written a few, but I think is this the only book you've written on pride? It's Pride, the Secret of Success. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my one trade book. Yeah, it has two titles because when it was in hardcover originally, it had a longer title, and I guess for paperback, they made it shorter, whatever title. I actually like the longer title better. That's the one I came up with. So, but so be it.
Well, I don't know who is this by. This is Mariner. Yeah, I don't know. The bright red is just great. I love the bright red cover on the softbacks.
Yeah, I think they did a good job with it for sure.
Yeah.
So if you check out the hardcover, like online, if you just see a picture, if you go to my website, it's there. The cover's beautiful. It's a peacock tail, but it's down, which I think is just
wow.
Wow, whoever did that, like they got it. So
wow,
it's cool.
Wow, that's great. Okay, so maybe just give us like an overview of like pride, what it is and what it isn't. And then we can talk about the two types of pride, or you can start talking about that because I think that's super important. I remember in grad school when I first learned about that, it like kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, oh, whoa, that's a crazy way to like characterize it, and it made sense. And then you talk even more specific about all those two types of prides and everything. So just kind of give us the overview of pride and what it is.
Yeah. So pride is, we've been talking about self-conscious emotions, the emotions you feel when you make a self-evaluation. Pride is the one you feel when that self-evaluation turns out kind of on the positive side, right? So you think, okay, something happens, you walk down the street and you see a friend and they smile, or someone you kind of know and they smile at you. That can, make you happy, but it can also make you think, oh, that person likes me, right? So then you sort of start thinking, I'm someone who's liked. That's a positive self-evaluation, and you feel pride. And of course, that's sort of like, a lame example of that. The more prototypical is like, oh, you achieve something, you score a goal in a game, you get a good grade, whatever it is. All these things make us feel good about ourselves. And what we have found is that that's really functional. That is to say, when we feel good about ourselves, it has all these sort of downstream consequences that ultimately function to help us boost our social rank in our group. It makes us feel better about ourselves, which in turn tells us, hey, we deserve high rank. We then are going to do things that make it more likely we will get high rank. We show a nonverbal display in our face and our body. We found that pride has a distinct nonverbal expression that's reliably recognized by people all over the world. It's also spontaneously displayed by people all over the world. And that display tells others that person's proud and that person deserves high status. And it sends the signal really quickly, automatically. Other people kind of can't help but see it that way. We've done studies where we have someone wearing they look like a homeless person. And then we compare them with someone wearing a business suit. And it doesn't really matter. If they show pride, the homeless person is going to be automatically seen as high status. It's sort of irrelevant what their actual status in society is, because that expression is so powerful. And so it's functional because status comes with all kinds of adaptive benefits. People who are higher rank in societies end up with more resources, better mates, more power, more influence over group outcomes, and so on. And then, like you were alluding to, there are two different kinds of pride. And, it's funny, you said a while ago that you would categorize pride as a negative emotion. And that's what we call hubristic pride. That's sort of the arrogant side of pride. But many people actually, when they first think of pride, don't think of the arrogant side. And in our culture in the US, I know I'm in Canada, but in the US especially, people actually, I think, more often think of the other kind of pride. We call that authentic pride. I'm torn about whether I've always been torn about that label, but it was hard to come up with. Hubristic pride was great because it's like there's already a label, it's Greek, but, it sounds fancy, but everyone knows what it means. It was harder. It was really hard for authentic pride, but I do like, I like the contrast because it implies, which I believe is correct, that hubristic pride is not based on an authentic sense of self. It's based more on sort of this grandiose, inflated sense of self. Whereas authentic pride really is about, hey, I worked hard, I had an achievement. That makes me feel really good about myself. Mm-hmm. And it has all kinds of positive consequences. It does boost social rank. It also makes people nice to others. It makes them want to help others. It makes others look up to them. It improves social relationships in all kinds of ways. So that's a really positive experience. And I think that's the pride that people are talking about when they want to make, their kids proud, right? Or they're proud of their children. It's the kind of pride right now, it's like Gay Pride Month, right? So like, that's, I think, the kind of pride that we talk about it all the time and no one really has any problem with it until you start thinking, well, wait a minute, where does that arrogant side come in? And so we've actually found these are two different experiences. They feel different. They're associated with the same nonverbal expression. So that's kind of interesting. That tells us it is part of the same emotion, but they have very different personality correlates. So people who tend to experience each one are somewhat different from each other. They have different social outcomes. They're associated with different kinds of like psychopathologies and that sort of thing. However, they both do seem to promote social rank, which is really interesting from a functionalist perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the first counter to that would be like, well, you're just talking about two different things then, right? Maybe we're just talking about two different emotions, right? You're talking about this authentic thing. I feel good about myself, or I feel like I've accomplished something. How is that again, the same thing as this negative, hubristic pride, where it's like, this arrogant, narcissistic kind of, I'm better than you, look at me, all these things. How do we, I guess, specifically know that these are two variants of the same emotion and not two distinct emotions by themselves?
Yeah, fair question. And ultimately, to me, this might sound like a cop-out. It doesn't matter a whole lot because it's really, that's just us making definitions and distinctions. Yeah. Sort of like in a biological. What I'd rather do is figure out why they exist, where they come from, what they do to people, all that stuff, and not worry that much about the semantics. Or like, well, are they the same? But here's why I see them as two variants rather than two different things. And although I fully admit, all the points you made are totally valid, and one could easily say, no, these are two different emotions. The reason I don't see it that way is because they do share the same nonverbal expression. And from an evolutionary standpoint, we have argued, and I've written about this, what's most likely, I think, is that they evolved from the same sort of like dominance kind of experience. So we know other species experience dominance in various ways. And it would make sense that humans would evolve to experience something like that starts out as kind of a general, I'm bigger than you, I'm stronger than you, I'm superior than you, which is not that different from hubristic pride. So it's probably likely that hubristic pride came first. But once humans got all these incredible cognitive capacities that we have, as well as a sense of self, which, at least at the level that we experience a sense of self is different than what every other species, experiences, that even chimps that have mirror self-recognition don't have many, many other things that we have that makes sense of self unique. Once we got all that, we became able to do things like, hey, I'm this kind of person. I'm generally good, maybe sometimes bad, but I just had an achievement that I worked really hard for, and I feel really good about myself for that thing. And ultimately that's going to build on my general sense of self, but I can keep the two things separate, right? And I can sort of say, this right now, I feel really good about myself for this thing I did and worked hard for. And I can feel that way and not think, hey, I'm better than everyone else around. And that probably is really adaptive, because thinking that you're better than everyone else around does lead to really problematic interpersonal consequences, right? Hubristic pride does lead to problematic relationships. People, coalitions form against someone who does that. People dislike them. People don't like working for them. So it's actually quite adaptive to experience authentic pride instead. And my guess is, sort of from an evolutionary standpoint, in our modern Western culture, what I would say weird culture based on research, we actually experience hubristic pride much more as a defensive process. It's not sort of a genuine sense of like, I am the best, I am the strongest. I think people who feel that way, and I'm not saying people don't, I think people do feel that way, but I think they feel that way because it's their way of defending against feelings of shame, right? That it's sort of this psychodynamic kind of defensive process. So, yeah.
Yeah. So a few things here. I guess the one thing on this, I totally agree with you on all of this. And I mean, having read your work and then others in the literature, this all, when you see the data, it, at least to me, it makes a lot of sense. I guess the one thing with these two types of pride is that it seems like from an evolutionary framework that because we're social, apes, if you will, we're always doing some type of, at a basic level, we're doing some type of signaling of sorts to other people in our group and then to other groups. And the kind of what you're saying, the hubristic pride probably, evolved first, is this way of signaling, right? And I think of signals as a type of almost like a heuristic of sorts. It's a shorthand to tell you something else about what's going on and where things are at in position or how things are proximal or not. And in that way, how do we understand that, there's this, is pride a sense of like a system of sorts, right? Because here's what maybe it's the wrong way of looking at it, but you have pride, you have the two types of pride that can be adaptive or maladaptive in different contexts, if I'm right. And then you're trying to do it, pride to show something about your sense of self, which is important. Then you have pride for an establishment of social rank and order and dominance and hierarchy. So that's for the other and the social component. All of these things seem to be, and then I think you make in the book or one of the papers that pride is because of the nonverbal expression and the universality of it that has been shown from your research and others, that there is because it's so universal and the nonverbal piece of it, we could probably say that it's at least a basic emotion as well. Maybe it's a seventh basic emotion, possibly. And, I'm sure there's, people, have some gnashing of teeth at you saying that or whatever, but, that's a lot of things for one emotion. Mm-hmm. And is it something on the same level, both on how complex it is that maybe it has its own kind of system? The obvious example that comes to mind would be like disgust. I think many people see disgust as its own kind of system. A kind of internal system. It's not just one of the other emotions, right? Some, Haidt has done work on this, and other people some people can conceptualize disgust as a whole system, right? With, basic disgust, sexual disgust, moral disgust, et cetera. Do you see pride as a type of system and not just, another self-conscious emotion, or again, not to be too semantical. I typically hate semantic arguments, but I feel like the categorization or how it's organized is important.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I think I would say I totally support that viewpoint. And it's not how I, as an emotion researcher, that's not how I typically look at it. However, I completely, I think there's a very reasonable evolutionary standpoint to say there is a system that ties together self, pride, shame, social rank, and that all these things work together to produce a certain evolutionary outcome, which is helping people maintain and achieve higher rank in their groups, and that's adaptive and so on. And so pride is absolutely part of that system and functions in really important ways in that system. And yeah, I think that's a really useful way to look at it. And from that perspective, I think we can say that about every emotion, right? Like disgust, the point, anger is part of a system that's about, interpersonal and intergroup relationships and conflict and people having, the fact that people have to exist in a world where they have shared goals, but also different goals, but shared outcomes and so on. So I think that's a really interesting and useful way to study all emotions. And it's not typically the way that I go at it, but I think it's a cool way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So about the self, so this can get real philosophical and deep, so we can kind of scratch at it and, we don't have to go too deep into it, but you talk about, I think early on in the book, the concept of the self and obviously how pride and it's kind of a distant connecting emotion, shame, kind of in the inverse, is all about the idea of the self. this is a very general abstract question, but what does it mean to understand the idea of the self? Is some people say the self is an illusion? Is this just from the subjective objective? Like, I'm the subject and everything else around me, my world is an object, or is there something else more phenomenological of, what's the experience that we're having that transcends subject object? So again, there's a lot of philosophy in there, but how do you understand where pride kind of sits within what the self or the I is, in your best estimation?
Yeah, no, totally. And I think, I'll just say, like, as a non-philosophy person, my understanding is that, like, these questions, like, what is self-awareness? That's like one of the great unanswered questions of philosophy that I would love to see them answer. But I'm probably not going to do it.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah. No, the definition of self that I kind of accept is pretty much the one that William James put forth, like way back when, 120 years ago or something.
He's the best. He's the best.
Yeah. And so he distinguished between the I self and the me self, or a subjective kind of awareness. The I, being the, like, I am the one looking at things and doing things. The me self being the objective self, right? The self, the individual that the I is looking at and evaluating and so on. And I think that distinction proves to be pretty useful from a psychology perspective, from an empirical perspective, because we can study the me pretty easily, right? We ask people what they think of themselves. We are studying how the I looks at the me. And it's straightforward. And so with pride and all self-conscious emotions, what I would say is happening is that is the I being activated. So all of a sudden we become self-aware, looking at the me, the objective self, and saying, hey, do I like what the me is doing right now? Do I feel good about the me? Is the me exceeding my goals? Is it falling below my goals? Is it meeting my goals for the kind of me that I want to be, basically? And I call those identity goals, but other people have used other terms. So that's basically my take on it. Yeah.
And so with pride, it's trying to understand the me self and the I self and the interaction with that, right? How am I looking at the me and understanding where I'm at within social rank or what kind of status I do or don't have? So partway in the book, you talk about the kind of the fourth and fifth stages of developmental shifts for us as humans. The fourth one being the internalizing, externalizing evaluations, right? That social piece. And then the social emotions, which drive behavior. So maybe, you can go through all of them if you want, but those in particular, how do you understand those developmental shifts for us as humans, and where does, pride kind of fit in there?
Right. I mean, and this is not my work, this is developmental research, but which is not at all my specialty.
Right.
But yeah, my understanding is that, early on, children really look to their parents for everything. They don't know what's good. They don't know what's bad, right? That's, is it bad for me to break something? I don't know, made a loud noise. That's kind of cool. Right. But when the parent shakes their head and looks angry, kids very quickly, because anger, I think, is, this sort of, we have this genetically hardwired ability to know, oh, that's bad. I did a bad thing. Kids then very quickly say, okay, that's bad. But early on, I think the sense is like, okay, this bad thing happened, and, my parent doesn't like me, doesn't like what I did, but I don't care. I thought I made a really cool, loud noise, right? So sort of you have this distinction. Eventually, kids pass kind of a critical threshold where actually they internalize those norms. So it's no longer, I don't want to make my parent mad. It's, ooh, I don't want to be a bad kid, So it's, I'll get early on, I'll get the cookies if I can, as long as my parent doesn't know. And then it's, no, I don't want to be the kid who steals cookies. That's not the kind of person I am, right? It doesn't matter who knows. And that is, I think, a critical shift for getting self-conscious emotions.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. I think, one of the things that has been happening, and so more recently, and I mean, I know, if I remember correctly, I think you have collaborated or worked with Joe Heinrich, yeah? Yeah. He's brilliant. He's done a lot of stuff. He's done a lot of research, and so he has the recent book he put out last year, I think. Right?
Yep. I just finished it a few months ago. I loved it.
Yeah, it was great. It's I've read it twice. It's a lot in there. It's a lot in there. It's pretty dense. And I always think it says something about the person if your book is 700 pages and almost 200 of those pages are references and notes. So a lot of research in there. But he talks about
weird populations, weird being Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. I think I got that right.
Yeah.
And so, it's Westerners. And there's kind of a false dichotomy of like weird, non-weird kind of things. But, it's a helpful, if you think of people in Canada, US, in Western Europe, and then there's the rest of the world, right? There are cultural differences. And he spells out his whole cultural evolution argument. For you and your research on pride, how do we understand what pride looks like in non-weird cultures? Because I think one of the things about a lot of studies in psychology has been that it has been done in the West, and it has been done with typically, white folk. And it's like, okay, well, we've done all these studies, and some of them don't replicate, but we've done all these studies, and how do we know what that looks like for people in Papua New Guinea or Malaysia or, anywhere else in the world, and is there some universality? So when you're talking about pride as an aspect, you could put shame in there too, but as this pride as this aspect of understanding the me, how does that look like in non-weird cultures, and what are some of the cross-cultural elements of the self, and how do we understand how pride is expressed in other cultures?
Yeah. So I haven't studied the self cross-culturally, so I can't really address that. But I do think, it's a human universal to have a sense of self the way that we do, and the processes I described. But yes, in my work, we have looked at pride across cultures, because when I started studying pride, well, very few people had studied it at all. But the Ekman view was very much kind of in place then of emotions, which is to say there are these 6 emotions that are universal, and that's it, nothing else. And, here I came and said, well, okay, pride seems like it could be functional, right? Certainly it's relevant to status and social rank. That makes it a candidate for being adaptive, and does it have an expression? And we actually started looking for pride expression just, with college students at UC Davis, where I was in grad school.
Right.
And to be honest, like, we didn't know what we would find. I remember my advisor and I did this, and we sort of were taking bets, like, is people going to agree this is pride? And the results were shocking, right? One, we had to figure out exactly how to have people pose it. That was a little tricky, but once we figured out the components, the behaviors that actually, people were saying that's pride, we get 95% of people in a room saying, yeah, that's pride. We gave them all kinds of choices, but they were like, no, that's pride. So then it's sort of this question of, okay, well, is it just something that we Americans or North Americans understand? Is it something Westerners understand, or is it a universal?
Right.
And we had the opportunity to go to Burkina Faso and study this in a group of people who are totally cut off from the Western world. This is like, they lived in the middle of nowhere, basically, not even near a major city in Burkina. And this was 2003. So even the major cities in Burkina at that point were far from, most people had never left their town, certainly their country. Internet was sparse. It wasn't like how I'm sure it is today, but we did it with people who really were living in these mud huts, no electricity or plumbing,
Sure.
And it was amazing. And we showed them the photos, and they recognized pride the same way we do. That's
cool.
Pretty good evidence that, this is something universal. But,
yeah. Yeah. And I think you talk about in the book, and I think you give some of the pictures in the book, but typically pride is, kind of chest out, chin up, or maybe arms above your head or whatever. There's a certain kind of posture. So, it's the facial expression, I think, but it's also the kind of at least upper body posture of what pride is. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, no. And I think that's kind of why Ekman didn't include it, because he was looking at the face only. And if you just look at the face, you cannot tell pride from happiness. You really, if you see the head tilt up, there's some studies suggesting, okay, people will say pride, but the recognition rate's not as high. For our studies, we always include at least, waist up, because you're right, the expanded chest, along with the head tilt up, those are the critical pieces, right? And then the smile, of course, but that's really essential. And we found that that's actually what people do when they're proud. So we did a study looking at athletes in the Olympics, and I had collaborated with someone who's a judo coach. So we had all the judo competitors from the 2004 games. We coded all their behaviors. Winners showed exactly that sort of set of behaviors. And this was from people all over the world. So we were able to look at culture. Culture had no effect. And then we did the same thing with the Paralympics, where there's actually a blind judo competition. So blind athletes, including a small proportion of them who are congenitally blind. So they've never been able to see.
Wow.
This congenitally blind sample they also showed pride, the same display in response to success. And to me, that's, that's sort of like as good as you're going to get for evidence that this is, sort of a biologically innate kind of thing, because how could they have learned to show it?
Right.
They've never seen anyone show it. So.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And well, just as a counterpoint to that, shame is usually the opposite expression. It's shoulders slumped, face downcast, poor eye contact. It's the opposite. It's the exact opposite expression. Which is.
So, and I can tell you something really interesting about the shame expression in that judo study, which is that we found cross-cultural evidence for the shame display in response to failure. So people who lost their match did exactly what you just described. However, people from Western cultures, so North Americans and Europeans, Western Europeans, did not do that.
Interesting.
Which is fascinating because those of us who discovered the shame expression and been studying it, we're all from those cultures. So it's not the case that we're like, oh, here's this thing we think people show, but we've never seen it except when we travel to Africa, right? That's clear, or China or Asia, clearly that's not the case. We know this because we know people do it, but it's so discouraged in our culture, right? I mean, I'm sure you know this, Western cultures hate shame. You're not supposed to feel it. It's not okay to talk about, if you've ever said, I'm so ashamed of yourself, you're to someone else, you're unusual, because that's a really hard thing. People find that really hard to say. And so here you have these professional athletes in front of their entire country doing something that they must feel great shame about, right? I mean, losing a match really matters. And the last thing they're going to do is show that expression. So they suppress it. But what's amazing is that the congenitally blind sample, there everyone showed shame, right? And that makes sense because those people are going to be less aware of what other people are thinking, watching them. They're not used to watching, So I think that's really good evidence that it is universal.
Absolutely.
But then there's cultural effects on whether you express it and when you express it.
Yeah, that's very powerful. I didn't know that. That's really fascinating. And I think that this might be from Joe's work, but if I could have this wrong, but I believe it's, in Western or in weird cultures, guilt is a little bit more acceptable. It's like, oh, okay, you feel guilty about it and you can kind of, because guilt usually leads to reparative action anyways. And in shame is discouraged in weird populations. And I think it's the inverse is true around the world in non-weird populations where it's like, no, you don't want to feel guilt, but shame, you can admit to that. It's very interesting how it does, and it's not a complete, dichotomy there, but it is interesting how those things we can know it happens universally, but then knowing again some of the cultural norms and mores of things.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't ever heard that what non-Western cultures discourage guilt. I don't know about that, but I know shame is, you have to experience shame. It is appropriate. If you don't, you're shameless. And that's the worst thing. That's completely the case. So.
Yeah. And also with obviously there's the shame and guilt are closely aligned, but they are distinct. And so that also becomes really interesting in how you pull that apart. I kind of with that, we there's been some research that shows that shame can be felt obviously because it's about the self and it's about, social context as well. Shame is felt both publicly and privately. Is that also true for pride? That people will feel pride publicly, right? If it's trying to show rank and status, but do they also show it privately? If I'm in my room and if I get a really good evaluation, or if I'm a student and I get a really good grade and I see it on the screen and I feel super happy and I'm going to do the same thing, and again, it's hard to kind of, do those studies privately, obviously, but what do you know or think about how at least the expression and possibly, feeling of pride privately and publicly?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there has been no study that I'm aware of that looked at private expressions of pride. For the reason you said, I think you have to have it's really hard to get consent and that kind of thing.
Or you have to rely on self-report measures, which, those are
right.
Those are troublesome sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
My guess, so one thing, yes, people absolutely experience pride privately, but we know that, right? I mean, if you get good news about, a success that you had alone, you're going to feel pride. It doesn't matter that no one's there. Yeah, right. Yeah. And you probably will do what you just did, which is, show something. You might not jump up and down and show the full display, but I think the display, we do have this innate tendency to do it. And so my guess is there's some part of it that gets shown, but we're constantly modifying our behaviors, to be appropriate with norms and what we think the norms are. And sometimes that means expressing it really big because, that's what we're supposed to do. Other times it means in public, toning it down, right? I mean, there's, you get a test back in front of all your peers and you did really well and they didn't, you're a real jerk if you show a huge pride expression, right? So in that case, someone with good social norms and care for their friends or empathy is going to actually tamp it down. In private, there's no reason to tamp it down since no one can see you. But at the same time, I think we all sort of have this sense of like, I'm not supposed to be jumping around or dancing alone in my house. But I think some people do, right? And so my guess is there's a lot of individual differences there.
Yeah, it's like when you go to the job interview and they say, okay, we're welcome aboard, whatever, and then you get in the elevator and you start like dancing in the elevator all by yourself, right? It's right, it's that kind of thing. So it's interesting. There's obviously, if there's no hard data, there's no hard data on it, at least quantitatively or qualitatively. So it might be interesting research to do at some point, for if anybody's able to do it, but. Yeah. And I remember there's a few, it wasn't a lot. It was a few studies on shame that was expressed privately. And again, it's, I haven't looked at that research in a while, but it's interesting to note what, again, kind of just going back to the point you were making is that there is some, we can make some inferences to say that this is very likely that this is an innate quality. It's not just culturally dependent, even in the expression of it, which is, again, because cultures are so different and people groups are different across places around the globe, and then through time, the fact that they're going to have or recognize at least the same way it's expressed, really does show it's kind of endogenous to kind of how we are as humans. It's a human experience, which is super, super awesome. Okay. So with this, there's this piece here that you mention, and then you start to answer this question later in your book. And so I want to, just kind of discuss this and maybe just hear you kind of flesh out more about how you kind of make the two camps agree. So from an evolutionary psych perspective, pride is going to give what you've said, right? High status and high rank. And that's achieved through dominance, aggression, force. And so within these hierarchies, the social psych kind of folks, they're saying, well, but these are somewhat minimally effective. High status can also be achieved by being nice, competent, compassionate, kind. I think of the work of Michael McCullough comes to mind, right? He's done some of this stuff, and a few others. So again, pride is shown as expressing or displaying high status and rank. But is this, context dependent, or is this also seen in neutral settings? And how do you kind of, you talk about it in the book. So how do you kind of explain, well, maybe it's both, right? Maybe pride can be used to show that in a dominant, aggressive way, but then also in a compassionate, kind way. How do you kind of keep both camps happy and no one mad?
I think it's funny that there are these two camps, and it's always, my former grad student Joy Chang, this is her kind of main area of research, and she really, she's very much an evolutionary psychologist, but she's worked with people who, Cameron Anderson is someone who's done a ton of work on this sort of nice guy, basically nice guys get ahead, that is what you just said. The way to get status is be kind, be nice. And, she's tried to say to him, but look at the evolutionary psychology, it's actually the aggressive bullies who are getting ahead. And anyway, they have all these arguments. What our work suggests is that both do work. And this is actually based on Joe Henrich's anthropological work, where he did this ethnography, review of ethnographic studies, actually, where he found that in small scale traditional societies, kind of all over the world, based on the anthropologists who were studying there are two different ways to get ahead, and they are both effective in these societies. And he calls them prestige and dominance. Prestige is the being a nice guy, but also being smart, being competent, having skills, and looking out for others, trying to help others, bring them into your group, being what we would think of as a good leader, essentially. But then there is also dominance. And those are people who, use tactics of fear and intimidation, right? They basically say to others, you have to follow me, you have to do what I say, whether you like it or not, because if not, I'm going to hurt you. I will take resources from you. I will take your paycheck, and they can do that to be dominant because they have power. Historically it was because they were bigger and stronger. Certainly with, chimps, that's what it is. But it could also be because they're wealthier, right? Or they're the boss and they can do whatever they want. And the fact is, we all know leaders like this. We don't like them. We don't want to think that this works, but it does. And so we actually did a study, Joe and Joey and I did a study where we had people in small groups doing a task together, and we video record them, and we, got all these different measures of all kinds of stuff. And we found that, in fact, some people did use the dominance tactics, right? And that's based on ratings from other people in their group, ratings that we had outside observers because we video recorded them. We had people watch the videos after, and we had them rate how dominant versus prestigious they were, and self ratings as well. And in all cases, what we find is that, some people use these tactics of intimidation and aggression, and those people are not liked, right? Everyone else is like, this guy's a jerk. Some people use the tactics of prestige, trying to sort of use competence, bring others into the conversation, be kind about it. And those people are well liked. Both people actually get power over the group. So when we look at who's rated as most influential by the rest of the group, as well as outside observers, we look at who's looked at the most, measuring looking time with eye trackers. And when we looked at who actually controlled the decision, right? Whose views were led to the ultimate decision most strongly, it doesn't matter. Both dominant and prestigious leaders did. And there was no difference. These were both really strong effects. So, as much as we, people who sort of come from the like, no, you got to be nice to get ahead, don't want to believe that it works to be a bully. It does work to be a bully. If your goal is power and influence, right? If your goal is to be liked, if your goal is to have people want to respect you, want you to be the leader, then no, that's not going to work. These people don't like the dominance. They are afraid of them. Although I think, as you kind of alluded to, there are certainly contexts where we do choose a dominant, right? Well, when our group is competing against some other group, we may well want a dominant leader to take charge, be the bully against another group. And actually, that's work I'm doing with a current student right now, looking at whether intergroup conflict leads to a preference for dominance leaders. And in terms of pride, I think this is kind of a really nice thing when Joey became my grad student that we started studying and with Joe, which is to say, okay, we have these two kinds of social rank. We have these two kinds of pride. Right. We know that pride evolved to promote social rank. Maybe it's the case that authentic pride promotes prestige and hubristic pride promotes dominance. And thus far, that's exactly what we found, basically, that the feelings that you have when you feel hubristic pride, the behaviors that it leads you to engage in, all those things are sort of ideal for taking charge in an aggressive, intimidating, kind of bullying, arrogant way.
Yeah. I remember reading it because it's an interesting finding because you usually don't get both answers. It's not both are true, right? It's just like, we got to pick a side that, one is more correct or more accurate. And there's multiple paths up the mountain of social rank, I guess. Right.
Yeah.
And so how do we understand, I think you talked about this shortly after that part in the book of, the positive and negative aspects of authentic and hubristic pride, right? Most people would say that authentic pride, and maybe this is context dependent, or maybe in more neutral settings it isn't, but can there be negative aspects of authentic pride? And can there be positive aspects of hubristic pride? Again, the terms are silly. I'm not trying to make it a good, bad kind of thing, but the way that I would probably look at it is, are there adaptive and maladaptive ways for both hubristic and authentic pride?
Well, hubristic pride, sure, that's easy because it is, from a psychological, there's sort of, the word adaptive is used in two different ways in psychology, which is problematic. But so we can talk about if something's psychologically adaptive, which just means, is it healthy, right?
That's how I'm using it. Right.
So no, it's not healthy. Right? They don't feel it. They're selfish. They don't, ultimately, I think they don't feel good about themselves. There's shame driving a lot of it. They have problematic relationships. We found that people high in hubristic pride also report shame. They have low self-esteem. So yes, it's not good from that perspective. From an evolutionarily adaptive kind of perspective, it is good because, as I just noted, to the extent that hubristic pride puts us in a position where we can attain dominance, that will allow us to attain power and influence, which has these ultimate evolutionary adaptive outcomes. So I think, that one is absolutely both ways. Authentic pride is trickier because it's psychologically adaptive, right? People who feel it, they're happy, they have all the good personality traits, right? They're extroverted and conscientious. They work hard because they want to have these positive outcomes. They're nice to others. They give others advice. They help others. They have good relationships. So they're popular. It's hard to think of a negative trait associated with authentic pride. And then they do actually get ahead. They are high in social rank. Now, I will say authentic pride is positively correlated with some forms of narcissism, as is hubristic pride. So maybe that's sort of a negative that it's, I think the forms of narcissism that relate to authentic pride are kind of the, what we call grandiose narcissism, right? So it's sort of the like, assertive, taking control, and to some extent, probably self-enhancement, right? These are people who they work hard, they think they're great, and they feel good about themselves. And perhaps at a level that they also have high self-esteem. So, they both genuinely feel really good about themselves, but maybe to some extent there's that kind of narcissistic, like, well, I am better than other people kind of thing. So I guess that could be a bit of a negative thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With that, how does, you were mentioning, and I was actually thinking about before you just mentioned it, was where does shame fit into this? Because, so I alluded to it early in the conversation, there are definitely psychologically adaptive elements of shame. There are some pro-social elements of shame, but most people see shame as a quote unquote negative. But it seems that, yes, this might get more in the weeds, but where does folks that are exhibiting this hubristic pride, where does that start and end with shame, right? Because if they're also kind of this, if there's this latent kind of shame, and then the hubristic pride is more manifest, where does that start and end? Another way of saying that is, if folks are, because obviously we can feel many emotions, different emotions at the same time. What is the kind of, is there like is it a poor recipe of, well, you have hubristic pride and that's derived from, or that's coming out, or it's adjacent or concurrent with some type of negative shame as well? And, that's just a bad mix? Or how do you understand, I guess, the kind of interactions between the two?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. I would love to, see research looking at that. It's so hard to measure that kind of stuff, though, right? Because
it's chicken egg thing.
Shame and it's all hidden and I think largely unconscious.
Yeah.
My take would be that someone who much like theories of narcissism that I very much buy into, which suggests that the narcissistic person is someone who has learned over time that the way to deal with their deep-seated shame, and they have deep-seated shame for various reasons due to early upbringing experiences, so on. But the way that they deal with it is to bury it, hide it, and put on top of it this layer of "I'm the greatest," right? So that is a coping mechanism, and I would say that that's the "I'm the greatest" feeling is hubristic pride, right? That is what they kind of force, allow, encourage, whatever you want to put it, themselves to experience, so as to not experience shame. But it's artificial, right? It's not
right. It's not authentic. I mean, it's inauthentic. Yeah. And I would say that probably that type or that form of narcissism that you're describing would be the one that's most commonly associated with the dark triad of personality.
Oh, yeah. For sure.
And again, I talked to David Buss a couple of months ago, or about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, and we were talking about this because for his new book that had come out recently, and I had mentioned, and he agreed that the dark triad of personality, which narcissism is one of them, and that's a loaded term, but there are adaptive aspects of that dark triad as well. Kind of like what you're saying in terms of how we get ahead, how we are able to fend off other groups that are trying to harm us, right? There are, for example, people will say that there was a paper written on it. It was a fun paper to read that they looked at, I'm going to forget it. They looked at kind of like the past, few presidents from 1960 up until current. I think went up to George Bush at the time. It's an older paper now. And they tried to see how many, again, it's observable, but how many, elements of psychopathy do they have, right? And how do you have these elements to get ahead? Because people in power need to have some element of, psychopathy. And again, right, we understand that that's a continuum of sorts, right? Sure. And so I just wonder, where does this kind of negative hubristic pride, how does that load on to different aspects of personality? And how, because you were talking about that at the top, right? Of looking at the interactions between personality and then the different, emotional theories, and how do we understand the kind of interactions and correlations between that? And so, I wonder, this is a kind of, again, a caricature of sorts, but what kinds of profiles of things, or what kinds of, not say templates or molds, but of the kind of person that's going to have these kinds of ingredients, if you will, of, getting ahead in a negative way, some amount of hubristic pride, and, what kind of narcissism is underneath of that. All of these things that are kind of building to really psychopathology at a certain point. So I don't know if you have any. It's all messy, but
it is messy. I mean, we found, so people high in hubristic pride at a trait. So people who say on a regular basis, they tend to feel hubristic pride. And we measure it with items like, rate the extent to which you feel. It's 7 items, and it's like arrogant, conceited, egotistical, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And people who endorse that tend to, they tend to feel shame a little bit. They tend to have low self-esteem. They tend to be disagreeable, so low in agreeableness, and high neuroticism a bit, but not that high. That's not kind of the main feature of it.
Right.
And they do tend to show, like, they report anxiety. They're more likely to be depressed. So it is all those sort of negative kind of traits. But then if you measure sort of an approach orientation, need for power, behavioral activation system, that kind of stuff, they're high on that, right? So they are status seeking, and out there in the world approaching things. They're not hiding away. My take is it's sort of like they're the grandiose narcissist, but they have more frequent swings to what I would call fragile narcissism, right? That, hubristic pride is positively correlated with both grandiose and fragile narcissism. I guess it's related to every kind of, because there's just this swinging back and forth a lot. I think that the shame and all that stuff is much closer to the surface than it is with someone who scores high on grandiose narcissism, but would never, also has high self-esteem and, would never acknowledge shame, that kind of thing. So,
that I think that's particularly instructive. I think that's a really helpful way of saying that.
Yeah.
In terms of, just as a aside here, if I remember correctly, you've created we're going to get to the last point here in a minute, but you've created at least a measure or a handful of measures on pride. Is this correct? Yeah.
Well, so there is a self-report scale that you can use to measure both authentic and hubristic pride. It's 14 items total, 7 items for each. You can measure them at the trait or state level. It's available on my website. It's been translated into a few languages, so that might be helpful. And then, we also measure pride non-verbally. So I've sort of developed a coding system to code pride from facial and bodily behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Is that the only one that's out there, or in measuring pride? And is this state and trait pride, or
the self-report measure?
Yeah.
That's a great question. It is the only validated measure. I'm trying to think. There was a measure a couple of years before ours that was much more broad, kind of just general. I can't remember what it's called. It's part of this measure that measured a whole bunch of emotions. It's not really widely used. My understanding is that people either use our measure if they want to get authentic versus hubristic pride, or they just say, do you feel proud? Which is fine. Like, our measure doesn't include the word pride because we found it loads highly on both scales, and we want to actually measure them distinctively. If you don't want to know which, then it makes sense to measure both and look at both. And that's what I would certainly recommend. So then you have the flexibility, or use a word like, to what extent do you feel pride? To what extent do you feel good about yourself? And I've done that as well. So,
and just again, kind of on the opposite end of it is, is there a certain, maybe in research or maybe just maybe more clinically, if is there certain measures, for state and trait shame that you use or have used or recommend?
Yeah, so I use the TSCA for trait shame sometimes. It's great. June Tiney's measure, and I really buy into her distinction between shame and guilt, and that measure really nicely captures it. It's long, that's a downside, but it's reliable, it's well validated. I've used it a ton. At the state level, there's not much great at the state level because she has a state version, the SSGS, shame and guilt, state shame and guilt scale, I guess. It's very different. It's similar in that it sort of asks for, the items are kind of like, here's what you might feel this way in the situation. It's just the reliability is a lot lower. And in particular, the two scales are super highly intercorrelated. So when you use the TSCA, you measure shame, you measure guilt, and then you control for shared variance, and it works out really well. But with the SSGS, it's really hard to do that because they tend to be already correlated at like 0.7. It's hard to control for that shared variance. So anyway, when I measured shame at a state level, actually, I use a measure that a former student of mine, Aaron Weedman, developed with me, we have never published it. So we always say it is kind of like in prep. And it's, I think, like a 5 or 6, maybe 7 item measure. My current student, Eric Mercadante, I'm hoping he uses it a lot because we always measure shame with stuff. And I'm hoping we'll eventually publish it. But yeah, it's basically just items that when we ask people, think about a time when you felt shame, now list words and phrases that represent your feelings. These are the items that they listed essentially. And we did a bunch of studies and found these are the highest loading items. It's a good measure. It's sort of things like I feel bad about myself, I feel ashamed, that kind of thing. We published it. So
yeah, that's great. So your recent paper with Aaron Weidman, you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Picking up good vibrations. It's which journal published it? I'm forgetting now.
Emotion?
What's that?
Emotion?
Yeah, I think it was in the Emotion journal, right? Yeah. It's great. I really loved it. I read it a few times. So you're basically trying to, in the paper, from what I can understand, is how do we understand the distinct subjective experiences that people have and then assigning the emotions? And so basically my reading of it is like people feel, right, certain things, and they have experiences, subjective experiences. And how do we understand what those subjective experiences are? And we can put it to this kind of label. And there was a really cool thing there where it seems to be like there's in many ways that we kind of see these kind of umbrella emotions and then all of these kind of like sub emotions that go under it to try and kind of streamline it a little bit more. So maybe just generally just talk about the paper and the goal and aim and what you were trying to do with kind of this new taxonomy of sorts of trying to figure out emotions more accurately.
Yeah. So, the goal there, and it was just looking at so-called positive emotions, but,
Right.
The goal was sort of, Aaron had done this review of the literature, literally a quantitative review. So counting all the different emotions that people had studied. Yeah. This is
painful.
Like,
so painful.
I agree. I was glad I wasn't the one doing the hard labor there. But so basically they like read, 10 years worth of emotion journals or at least skimmed them for the emotions. And they found that I think there were like, over 30 different words used, or emotion words used to just positive emotions. There were even more if you include the negative. And so our thinking was, are these really, like, people are studying 30 different emotions? Does that mean there are 30 different distinct emotions that people experience or think they experience?
Right.
That seems like a lot. And it's a lot based on all the different taxonomies that have ever kind of been developed. And so what we did was we actually just we measured them. We took all 30 and we asked people to, we kind of tried to elicit them by saying, okay, think about a time when you felt admiration. Now write about it. And this is kind of a classic way of eliciting emotion. It's called the relived emotion experience, because if someone thinks about a past emotional experience and then really spends time kind of talking about it or writing about it, it kind of puts you back in that space.
Yeah.
So they're then reliving it. And then we have them rate the extent to which, or first we started with like, tell us what this experience is like. So we got a whole bunch of items, kind of like I was saying that we did before for shame, same method, tell us what admiration's like. Then we throw those items in, along with items to measure lots of other emotions. And we do this with several different emotions again and again and again, lots of iterations. Eventually, we then do these, factor analyses and so on. And what we're doing is finding out when people say they feel admiration, for example, are the feelings that they're reporting, like literally these phrases that we've come up with to describe feelings, are they really different from the feelings that people report when they are experiencing gratitude? Right? Are those two distinct emotions? And we can use factor analysis to tell us that. Mm-hmm. And we did a bunch of that in this paper. And then we followed up in another paper that was published in Affective Science that basically took all those findings and said, okay, I think in that study, there are 15 different distinct emotions.
Right. Yeah, 15, yeah.
But so in Affective Science, we actually did subsequent analyses where we said, are these really distinct at a level that we're comfortable saying it's distinct? How highly correlated are they? And I forget what kind of cutoffs we used, but we used another analysis. And we found that when we measure them at the state level, there are 9 different state positive emotions. 9 that you can consider them actually distinct subjective experiences, distinct feeling experiences. At the trait level, so when people say, do you generally experience this? Then there are only 5. right? And which makes sense. I think at a trait level, you should have fewer, because when you feel, if you are trait-like prone to admiration, you're probably also trait-like prone to gratitude, right? So it's kind of the same thing. So I think it's a useful endeavor, because it's like, okay, you think you're studying two different things here. You think that people who study gratitude, those are different than the admiration people. But is that really, you're just using different labels. And we had read the previous paper in Emotion based on his quantitative review, where we showed how much that happens. And it's kind of a ton, right? And it really creates a lot of clutter in the field, right? That you have all these studies that are actually measuring the same thing.
Same thing,
but you would know it if you do a search for them, because one uses this label and one, compassion is another great example, because you got compassion, empathy, sympathy. Are these really distinct? Tenderness is another one. And in fact, they're not all distinct, right? They overlap a ton. And so people who study tenderness, they should actually maybe be using a different label, or at least look at the broader literature, or maybe we call it something else and include all those studies. And that really, if you want to build a literature of understanding, you kind of need to build on the research that's already been done. And that requires knowing what research has been done on the thing you're interested in.
Yeah, I was going to say, just pull out those two examples from the results of the study, which was, so that one of them was, maybe because sympathy, empathy, tenderness, compassion are so similar. And in fact, on the paper, compassion didn't load as its own distinct thing, right? Which is super wild. And so maybe I think kind of the way, how do we square this away is, well, maybe compassion is just like the umbrella thing that we're talking about. And then sympathy, tenderness, empathy, and then there's different forms of empathy, if you will. Okay, those all kind of fit under the kind of umbrella of compassion. We're talking about the same kind of zip code, or the same world of this thing, its experience. And there's these nuances, but they're all very, very, kind of under that. Probably too long for here, but obviously Paul Bloom's written about empathy and all those things, and so he was kind of in the back of my head when I was reading it, and I was like, I wonder what he would think about this, because he's looking at it more for like moral decisions and stuff with compassion, but understanding like his whole cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, and then compassion, and he also does a different way of like trying to parse them out. You can see he's trying to do the same thing with his research. And so it's interesting how again, empathy is something that is used in pop psychology and just in kind of, the social world at this point. It's kind of overused, I think. And I do think something like this is really important, because people are talking about things and they're using like loaded words, and they're talking about something else, and it means really this. And so I think there is some, again, I usually hate, semantical arguments. I hate making arguments with just like terms all day, and like that really gets on my nerves. But I do think with this kind of stuff, when you're talking about experiences and what people are feeling, it is important to kind of parse it out a little bit.
Right. Oh, I absolutely agree. And I mean, I think Paul Bloom's point, I haven't read his book, but I heard him give talks on the against empathy work, and I love it. I think he makes a really, really good point there. There is something problematic, whether we call it empathy or something else, that is a problematic experience. And there's a version of that that's actually not problematic. And whether we call it compassion or something else, it's not problematic. Making that distinction is hugely important. I think it becomes problematic when someone says, someone uses the word empathy and someone else is like, no, you don't mean that. You mean that, it's like, well, okay, but that's not, like you could say, when you say empathy, you're referring to this experience, and that's really cool. There's a different version of empathy, or, there's a different version of that experience that is really problematic, and talk about it that way. But getting hung up on the labels, it's not going to get us anywhere. So I would love it if people take the message from Paul Bloom, because it's such an important message, but then not necessarily say, if someone says they're experiencing empathy, that means it's bad, because maybe they mean compassion,
But I agree 100% with what you're saying. And I think that's what's really important. I think you use contentment as another umbrella term with, is not necessarily distinct from happiness or joy. And people say, well, I just want to be happy. I just want to be happy. And it's like, I think many people mean content, but it's almost a synonymous term, right? I mean, it's a small nuanced term underneath, like, I want to be content, and the feeling of happiness is kind of what is aligning with it, whatever. And I think that's really important. I guess the last question I have here is, we have historically with emotion theory and everything, a handful of theories that, have explained, which comes first, the physiological response of the emotion. of understanding human subjective experiences. And people like Lisa Feldman Barrett, she's, obviously pretty well published, and she's written a handful of books explaining her not quite social constructivist, approach, but there's elements of that.
It's pretty social constructive. I
mean, it is. It is. I think that's because she's rooted in kind of the neuroscience of it. There are things that she definitely has it rooted in the biological piece of it, but her framing of it is social constructive. And there are others that are doing this research as well. Just kind of as a general phase, kind of with the work that you've done in this paper and other stuff, where do you see our taxonomy of emotions being in the future, and how do we understand that to accurately know emotions in humans from all cultures? What are your thoughts on that?
I think, I think it's a great question. I think that we need a taxonomy that's based in biology, that's based in neuroscience, it's based in physiology, as well as feeling experience, nonverbal display, behavior, functionalism. Because I take an evolutionary stance on emotions, what I have argued and written about is that we should start with function, right? That is to say, if the emotion exists in a way that's distinct from other emotions, that is because it serves a function that's distinct from what those other emotions do. If it served the same function, we wouldn't need a distinct emotion. So we may still make distinctions, because we're humans and we do lots of things that are really interesting. And those distinctions may be really interesting and have all kinds of, nice consequences, bad consequences, who knows, for our lives. But I think if we want to know at sort of a taxonomic, what is real-ish question, we should start with function. And then, make like any science, right? You come up with a theory, this should serve a distinct function. Is there something that does? Is that something, can I find evidence for it in behavior? Can I find evidence in biology, maybe physiology, maybe neuroscience? Can I find cross-cultural evidence? Can I find cross-species evidence, right? That's sort of, you build an argument to say, okay, maybe this is something that is distinct and universal and part of human nature. And that's sort of,
I 100% agree with you. And I that's usually my approach. That's how I was trained. And then that's typically how I also see it as well. And your most recent paper we were talking about really does a nice aspect of both qualitative and quantitative research. It's terribly difficult and painful to do, doing the emotion diaries and then putting it into our factor analysis. I mean, that's just like the best of both worlds. And that's what we should be doing, right? We shouldn't be taking shortcuts on stuff like that. And so it's just powerful work that you're doing. Jessica, I don't know what to say. It's been such a joy to talk with you about all this stuff. I mean, this is my wheelhouse. I could do this for hours, and it's just such a fabulous conversation. And I really, really, really enjoyed it, and I'm pretty sure listeners will as well. So I can't say enough thanks for taking your time and your energy. Tell people where they can find you, either online or where to get your books, or anywhere the relevant places to find you.
Yeah, no, and thanks. This has been a real pleasure for me too. So super fun to talk to you, and I wish you the best with the podcast. It's such a great thing you're doing.
Thanks.
People who want to read my published articles, all my journal articles are available online at my lab website. If you want to learn more about the lab or what we do or my grad students' work, or if you want to check out my book, Take Pride, all that is available at it's UBC dash, like the short dash, UBC-emotionlab.ca. So check it out. Please come visit.
Anything online? Are you anywhere social media or anything like that, or no?
I'm on Twitter, so you can follow me at Prof. Jess Tracy. Okay. JESTRACY. If you do a Google search for Jessica Tracy Pride, you'll find my work. So that's always just an easy way to go. But thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks so much. It really was a big honor. You're always welcome to come on, and we can talk about anything you ever want. And if you have more research, we can continuously talk about that. So just big thanks. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, totally. Thanks so much. It's fun.
All righty. Thank you.
All right. Take care.